Hey everyone, welcome to this exciting webinar we're having about liberation 1 year later. I can't believe it's already been a year, but we are excited to have some experts with us today. My name is Aaron Alpeter. I'm with Sourcify. Sourcify helps brands find and manage overseas factories. And as many of you, we've been extremely busy over the past year as we helped people navigate what was happening with all these tariffs. Should we stay put where we are? Should we move? Should we not move? And I'm joined today for this discussion with some real experts in the space. We'll start with Phil. Phil is a senior editor at Supply Chain Dive, which is one of the most well-known trade publications in the industry. They cover end-to-end supply chain, and he's been a key leader of Supply Chain Dive's coverage of trade policy during the second Trump administration, and just has a lot of experience covering retail and manufacturing supply chains. Graham is a co-founder and CEO of Importal. It's an AI native licensed customs brokerage, and he's been building a new category of customs brokerage that automates compliance from origin to destination through AI agents and licensed brokers. And so he's extremely busy, even today, with a lot of the tariff refunds and questions that are going on. And last but certainly not least is Alex, who is the CEO of Passport. If you don't know Passport, you should. It is the leading internationalization solution in the market. Alex has been in cross-border trade for, I think, over a decade, and he's a well-known and recognized voice on global trade and international expansion, regularly speaking on the complexities, the opportunities of selling worldwide. And so before we kind of get in and have this conversation, I just want to level set and remind everybody what Liberation Day is, or what it was. So it was a year ago today, and this is when President Trump announced basically a floor to tariffs. There was a 10 to 50% floor announced on virtually all countries importing into the US. And this was something that I think we had kind of known that tariffs were going to come, but the scope and the breadth and also the mechanics of how these came about were pretty sudden, at least in my opinion. I know there was a lot of consternation early on where they're like, well, how did they figure this out? And it looked like they were looking after the trade deficit and kind of, more of a blunt instrument as opposed to being really specific in terms of areas that they were working on. But this was the floor, and this was kind of ushering in this new trade policy regime that's been so core to the second Trump administration. In terms of specific countries, China has had the biggest volatility over the last year. And you can see that the tariffs were announced basically with everybody else. And then through a combination of other tariffs that came through, there's a period there in May, which I think we've all got scars and gray hair from, where tariffs were announced at 185%, which is effectively an embargo. And so this was just this remarkable period of time where both countries were kind of staring down, looking to see who would blink first. There was a deal that was struck to a much more modest 40% tariff that came through. I never thought that we'd be celebrating a 40% tariff, but we were, and that's been roughly where it is right now as they work through the detente. There's been a lot of questions about, did Liberation Day do anything? Has it had the impact? There was lots of discussion about, hey, is it going to get rid of fentanyl? Is it going to move jobs back to the U.S.? Is it going to impact the trade deficit? And you can see here that, at least on the trade deficit account, it looks like there has been some movement on this space. And so there's a lot that's still up for debate. I think it's still early days, despite it being a year. But that's kind of the level set of where we are now. And I want to kind of get started with our panelists. And maybe, Alex, I can start with you. Looking back on Liberation Day a year later, what actually changed and what's not changed at all?
One big thing is the supply. The supply chains are viewed through a political lens now in a way that they never were before. There was this one moment that really hit me was when Trump raised the tariff for India because India was buying Russian oil. And those are the kind of things that I think supply chain professionals never really considered or thought about in years past. And now they have to. Tariffs are much more politicized than they used to be. So that was like a big change. The other big change was around decoupling from China. So before Trump, about 13% of our imports came from China. That's been cut. The number of Chinese the amount of Chinese imports has been cut about half. And our trade deficit with China has been cut about half. China represents less than 10% now, so about 13% before Trump, now less than 10% of our total imports. But what hasn't changed is fundamentally, at the end of the day, reshoring hasn't really manifested itself yet. We're only a year in, and these kind of changes take a really long time. So it might still happen, but that hasn't really changed too much. So domestic manufacturing, it's up, but it's not up to the extent that I think the administration would have hoped for. Um, I'll leave it at that. Those are kind of the big things that hit me.
No, I appreciate that. Phil, anything you would add? I think, Alex, the thought of just these supply chains becoming political now is something that I hadn't really thought of, and I think definitely resonates with me. But Phil, what sticks out to you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point from Alex on the kind of politics being like something you need to now bake into your supply chain planning strategy, because we also saw that with kind of the Trump administration's push to annex Greenland, that there were tariffs threatened. The threat got walked back, but still that's something you need to be aware of. I think some of the things that haven't changed are actually kind of what to me I'm most interested in is the last year we've seen that the reciprocal tariffs come in and now they're gone because of a Supreme Court ruling in February. But that doesn't mean that the Trump administration is like slowing down. Like they've been building kind of a foundation for there to just be baseline tariffs generally during this whole past year. Now, whether that was to prepare for the Supreme Court's decision or not, I don't know. But I think we just need to be ready for that. This is going to be a key part of this administration's trade policy, and it's not something that will, as Alex mentioned, we're not going to see like companies suddenly just be producing in the U.S. more tomorrow. But I do think it's something they have to consider. I do think part of the reason we didn't see this huge like reshoring wave, at least in terms of like physical like shovels in the ground, is just because it takes so long and it's difficult to make long-term plans when things shifted so quickly. I mean, we only really had the reciprocal tariffs fully in effect for, I think, 8 to 9 months, or something around there. And that's not a lot of time to then say, okay, well, now we have to move everything everywhere. And because so many places were tariffed, it wasn't like, oh, well, we could just move from China to Vietnam because Vietnam was still getting hit, that kind of thing. So that's kind of my takeaway of the last year. It shook things up a ton. It's shown us the direction it's going. And I think following how it will keep building and potentially to be a more durable tariff regime because of some of the statutes that will be used going forward, I think will be worth watching.
That's helpful. Now, Graham, your life hasn't been any different last year, right? Because you were filing customs before, and now you're filing them afterward. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that things changed a lot from that time period. I would think the biggest thing that changed for, I'll go with the customs brokerage in relation to filing entries for importers, was just the complexity of the filings, right? We went from a world of maybe one HTS code having to be declared to up to four, right? Steel and aluminum content being broken out, all these variables that overnight emerged as compliance prerequisites of success. And with that came just an astronomical amounts of broker errors, right? So a lot of PSEs needed to be filed in order to recoup maybe overpayment or to file to amend an entry to if it was an underpayment. So that was something that really stood out to me, is just how complex customs brokerage got. And over the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of investments into kind of freight tech, visibility, supply chain, but customs never really got that love. We're seeing a lot of companies emerge trying to take on that challenge, but there's just a big gap between the difficulty of filing entries and the technology that importers and brokers are using today. So that was a big one. What didn't change for me that I'm super encouraged about is entrepreneurship and just the grit and determination of American importers, right? I threw a lot of cold water on some candidly horrible ideas around changing classification or trying to change origin or doing all these crazy things. But I was really encouraged by just the grit and determination of importers across America of, kind of coming together. Let's work through this. We're all going through it together and trying to find creative solutions and not just sitting on your hands and accepting it. So that was really exciting for me.
Yeah, Graham, what are the impacts of having more detail in these filings? I mean, on one hand, that could be a better thing because generally speaking, more data is better than less data. but I could also see it maybe being a negative thing because of not just the issues that people are coming up with misfilings, but potentially it being easier for people to reverse engineer your product or see where it comes from. So, have you thought about kind of some of the impacts of just people having a posture of giving more data to customs?
Yeah, I think that there has been a little bit of hesitancy around, kind of giving more details. I think the core issue with that is that the importer doesn't really control the data set that they receive. Yes, they can work with their supplier to get certain data points, but if you're a mid-market company, it's pretty difficult to tell that manufacturer, hey, you need to change the structure of your invoices moving forward. That's kind of a tough sell. So I think the lack of information that was able to be given by suppliers was really difficult. But I think from the importer side, especially with the 232 tariffs for all these kind of derivative products, think kind of the Yeti mugs and things like that, that they didn't have the steel content associated with this product, or they didn't know the steel mill and certificate and all the things customs is asking for. So I think in some ways the amount of data required became just too much for brands, to where they had to overpay tariffs because they didn't know their steel content. So yeah, I hope that answers that.
No, that's interesting. I mean, Alex, are you seeing similar things with kind of all the cross-border localization work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think one part of this that people don't really see or talk too much about is that there were some reciprocal tariffs put on US brands and goods. We kind of do the analysis and we always think about it in terms of what are we importing into the US. But US brands also have very big businesses abroad, especially in Canada, in Europe. And Canada put on a 25% tariff on a specific list of goods. And that's also some work that nobody really did before. It was just much more standardized, and the minutia detail of the specific type of product or the specific material didn't really matter before. It was all kind of either under the USMCA free trade agreement, so it was duty free anyways, and it didn't really matter. And now people actually start to pay attention because Canada put on that surtax, not on every good, but on a specific list of protected industries that they want to have. Same with, I mean, impacts e-commerce less, but China put tariffs on like U.S. soybeans. That became a thing, and we had to kind of bail out the farmers here in the U.S. So there's been some knock-on effects that we've seen, and it's become a thing where people just much more in the weeds on what they're declaring, because there is some quote unquote tariff hacking that you can do to lower the cost that you pay, that an American brand has to pay when they're importing into another country as well.
Yeah, I think to your point on the reciprocal stuff, it's been very interesting being an American living in Canada during this time. And just, people would do what they could from a purchase intent, even beyond the tariff, where if there were strawberries that came from California, they didn't want to buy them, right? They'd rather pay a little bit more or forego those. And so I think there's the impact of the actual tariffs, where I think, Ontario and Canada in general put a lot of Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee bourbon or whiskey on tariff, and basically eliminated that market, which has caused a lot of impacts to that specific industry in those specific states. But even beyond that, there's been a hesitancy to actually purchase Canadian goods. We've talked a little bit about this idea that jobs were supposed to come back, and that the point of these tariffs was to bring back jobs. It seems that the narrative around tariffs has changed quite a bit, whether it be fentanyl, whether it be containing China, whether it be trade deficit or paying down the budget deficit. What do you guys make in terms of what was actually the point of all of these tariffs?
I do think that addressing the trade deficit is a big part of it. It's not only mentioned within it, but something that has kind of stayed true throughout it. As you mentioned with the fentanyl trafficking or our immigration priorities of the Trump administration, those have kind of been less pronounced, or at least discussed in recent memory. But the trade deficit continues to be one. I know the U.S. Trade Representative, I think just today, was speaking about how the trade deficit's come down. I think there's some key context around some of that too. Is the trade deficit's down pretty significantly these first 2 months, but that's also in comparison to a time when a lot of importers were front-loading goods ahead of these tariff announcements, including the Liberation Day one. If you look at the 2025 trade deficit, It was marginally lower than 2024 from data I've seen from the Commerce Department. So I think the trade deficit is like the big piece of it, at least from what I've seen. But as Alex and I mentioned a little earlier, there is also the using tariffs as a geopolitical tool as well. And I don't think that's something that you're gonna like is going to be explicitly stated necessarily. So those are kind of what I see as like the main goals of them, especially the Liberation Day ones.
Yeah, I could double click on what Phil said just to add one point. I think there was a bullseye target on China specifically in regards to the trade imbalance and just decoupling. This is really the first administration that's talking about China in that way, as like an adversary, and economic warfare. That's thankfully that's the kind of war hopefully that we ever get into with China or any other country. But that has worked. That's what I kind of said in the beginning. There has been a lot of decoupling. There's one other big piece of this, which is another uh, uh, less discussed, but also very meaningful part of Liberation Day. Maybe not that day specifically, although I think it was announced that day, but it was the removal of the duty de minimis, which was specifically within the bullseye of China. There's another bullseye on Temu in Xi'an and the super low cost goods that were flooding our postal system, like literally hundreds of millions of packages in the US, not paying any duties or tariffs. And the duty de minimis went away. So I don't know what the volume numbers are for those companies, but it's just, kind of at least try to level the playing field for American businesses that were in the same group. So that's other big thing I think for the Trump administration. I'll add just one other thing. They did have a goal with the funds that they were trying to raise from the duties and tariffs. This is also in Polymarket, which is I think we were talking about actually before the webinar began. But Polymarket has a thing on whether or not there's going to be tariff stimmy checks that get sent to Americans. I think the probability is low, but Trump has talked about that, and that has been something that his administration has talked about, which they floated this, and I think that this is just pie in the sky, but they floated, eliminating the income tax and just being able to fund the government with make the others pay kind of thing, right? So funding everything with tariffs. So there was another part of this, grand economic plan in relation to the tariffs as well.
Yeah, I was cautiously optimistic that maybe that would have happened, but I think this administration has been a little bit disjointed in kind of their approach in other areas. I think particularly the big beautiful bill and kind of blowing up the deficit that way is like, well, maybe they're not the deficit hawks that they're positioning themselves to be. One of the things that people were really freaking out about in April and May of last year was just that like this was going to be so bad for inflation, and this was going to hurt the consumer enormously. And we needed to have free and open trade because it made everybody more prosperous. And to date, we haven't seen inflation nearly as bad as I think the doomsayers were saying in April and May of last year. I'm curious, Graham, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think first there was a lot of doomsday, just kind of looking back to the Great Recession and how there was this notion that tariffs caused that Great Recession to have a trade depression to happen. I think we want to learn from our history, but understand that it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So I think a lot of people kind of attracted themselves to looking back and saying, "Oh my goodness, it's going to be this all over again." I think at its core, there's a few things. We had a strong dollar, so that definitely helped. And to the point you made around inflation was kind of already at a lower percentage point compared to, call it 2020, 2021, when things were pretty hectic. But I think as well as that we saw just a lot of companies eat these costs, right? Obviously, some passed them on directly to the consumer, but I think a decent chunk of companies were able to absorb these costs and able to not directly pass them on to the consumer. But I think over time that started to change. We did start to see a lot of kind of tariffs at checkout. That's why we're seeing kind of a handful of brands so in litigation with kind of individuals trying to recoup those tariffs that they paid to those companies. So yeah, those would be the three ones that I would kind of point to.
Do you guys get a sense that this idea of holding back on passing the inflation on to consumers, or are we do we have a backlog of stuff and that's going to unwind itself in 2026? Or do you think it's going to basically exist the way it is now and people will just accept lower margins or hopefully anticipate that these tariffs will be wound back even further?
A lot of retailers that I've like spoken to or reported on generally like they implemented like short-term mitigation strategies. I think there was a lot of, especially right before and right after Liberation Day, a lot of like wait and see how this is actually going to evolve before we're going to put in like drastic measures. I think Graham's right that we might not have seen huge passage of tariff burden onto consumers like in the first half of last year, especially, but we've started to see that more in the second half. More companies began raising prices and specifically saying because of tariffs. So I think, assuming that like tariffs are going to stay with us, and I do think that is the case, I do think we'll start to see larger like ripple effects as we go long term. I think a big part of why there wasn't the huge doomsday stuff is because, again, I think it's really important to emphasize like how we've only been in this for a year. Seeing some of I'm not an economist, so I don't want to speak too out of turn, but the long-term effects of like this, if this is in place, these types of tariffs are in place for a really long time, I think will play out over several years versus several months, and how that will impact consumers. We'll see. I think something that really helped was the American consumer was really resilient last year. We didn't see huge drops in spending. We saw some like differences in like basket size and stuff, and the types of consumers that were spending at what types of places. But I think that was also part of it too, which was pretty not surprising to see, but like I thought was pretty interesting to watch as prices were going up, whether related to tariffs or not.
I'll add one thing. There was an interesting report that I think Morgan Stanley put out that basically tried to use econometric data to quantify where this increase in tariff went. And they basically broke it down into 3 buckets. I don't remember the exact weighting, but they were roughly speaking equal. One was the suppliers did eat some of it. So like a portion of it, this was just like a negotiation tactic, that a lot of brands use that says, I can't eat, I can't raise my prices. We're both out of business. You got to give me something, and there was some give on the part of suppliers. The other part of it was brands ate some margin. So you could see it in the earnings release, like Lululemon, they had reported incrementally less margin year over year. And that's, then they attributed to tariffs and it made sense, So again, something the consumer isn't really going to see. A shareholder is going to see it, but a consumer isn't, necessarily going to see it. And then I guess there's 4 buckets. And then the third bucket is kind of substitution. So like brands would basically, start to make their hero product the stuff that they make in like Mexico versus China. And as we talked about earlier, there was a lot of movement away from China, which was the highest hit in terms of tariffs in general. So wherever it was possible, brands did try to move production to like, Mexico and other countries where comparable costs, maybe a little bit more expensive, but at least you're not getting hit with those big tariffs. And the last sliver is, the inflation did go up a little bit. It wasn't zero. There was some percentage. I think it's like 2%, and half of that was attributable to tariff, 1%. And 1% is actually a lot. In the grand scheme of things. So there was some inflation caused by tariffs. It just wasn't as bad as people thought it was going to be. So 1%, 1.5%, whatever it was. But basically, those are the 4 buckets, and they're all kind of roughly speaking equal, and that's where it all went.
You mentioned a couple of times that people were looking to diversify away from China. And I know we saw a lot of people who tried. Where do they end up going?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to the commodity, right? Obviously, like if you're importing apparel, right, you have certain geographies. First time ever in my life as a customs broker, I cleared a bunch of goods made in Madagascar this year. So that was a weird one. Kind of came out of nowhere. I'd never seen that one before. So there was a decent amount of diversification across supply chains. I would say the The big one that won for our customers was transitioning away apparel goods out of China and moving them to Peru. We saw a really big kind of shift to Peru. Kind of the free trade agreement is still in place, so the general duty gets wiped out, but there's still a tariff. It's kind of a fun fact, a free trade agreement that still has no free trade. So that was always fun. But yeah, I think it really comes down to the commodity. But I think it's also for those who are listening that may not be like super in the weeds of trade compliance or supply chain and logistics is, not every product can be just picked up and moved to another factory, right? So it's not as simple as like copy and paste into Thailand. When I was making this super niche product with incredibly sophisticated specs, that's really difficult to kind of get up and running. That requires future investment, which tariff uncertainty just made impossible. How am I going to pick up this mill, this producer, this product, and go ship it somewhere else where next week that tariff is, next year that tariff's even worse than where I was? So it really comes down to commodity, but it was difficult for some brands and some products.
Yeah, in addition to apparel going to Peru, did you guys see anything else with electronics or medical devices or food and bev, anything like that kind of sticks out?
On the electronics side, I did a piece last year around when the Nintendo Switch 2 launched, and how Nintendo's not a notoriously pretty buttoned up. They're not like one to share tons with us, but in working with a reporter at one of our sister publications, kind of learned about how they were kind of shifting things of maybe finishing goods in Vietnam, that kind of thing. So I think there probably was some exploration of that in that sector, but I think Graham's right, and we've heard from several companies that there's just some goods that they make or products that they need that they can't just magically make somewhere else. There's specific reasons why they're made certain places, and again, like Graham said, the uncertainty of this tariff kind of shifting over the last year has made it difficult to really be like, okay, well, we need to make this now in this country, because you don't know if that country is then also going to be hit.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment. I mean, on the Sourcify side, we saw so many boomerangs. So people would be in China or in India when tariffs were really high, and they'd just say, hey, we've got to go elsewhere. And so they would engage us, and we would look in Mexico, we'd look in Morocco, we'd look in Peru, we'd look in Canada, the US. And in some cases, we weren't able to find manufacturers who could make the volumes that they wanted at the quality that they needed at the price that they could afford. And so despite lots and lots of effort by lots of brands, there were still a sizable amount of people who said, you know what, despite this really high tariff, I still need to be in China. And I think that was really interesting and really telling. And it really, underscored this idea that you can't move supply chains overnight. It's something that's going to take, decades to really rewire and go through. And Phil, you mentioned some of the uncertainty was going on with just the trade policy. And, I wonder if we can kind of go back in time, what it was like, maybe Alex, as you guys were trying to advise customers on this localization piece to be basically managing tariffs by tweet.
It's tough. There's no good advice to give in a situation like that, because there's just so much uncertainty. I think, my default was just wait and see, wait until the last moment, where you have to make a decision. Wait, because you never know, something might change. And then Kobayashi, they have a really interesting Twitter feed on this stuff. They started to formulate the Trump strategy, like say something really outrageous on like a Friday, let everybody like freak out on the weekend, and then before the market opens, pull it back, and have everything. And like it's kind of playing out in this Iran war to a certain extent. They kind of mapped the pattern, the art of the deal, Trump pattern to what he's doing with like all the misdirection, all that kind of stuff. So there is clearly like a pattern at play here. But when you're like April 1st, 2025, Liberation Day, and you're like 2 or 3 months in, it's like very tough knowing what to do in that situation.
Yeah, and I know a lot of companies, when going back to that period, is I think in April, May, there was like scrambling to figure out how can we stop this? How can we completely like get away around it? And then there was kind of the, come to Jesus moment over the next 2 months of like, all right, this is here and we just need to prepare for it. And I think by the summer of last year, companies they just wanted certainty. Like, okay, I'm going to have to pay a tariff, or I'm going to have to move something. I need to know what that is. Because again, like we've all said, making long-term plans when things changed day to day, week to week, hour to hour, even like it's just impossible.
Being a year removed, what do you think was the most impactful piece? The actual money that was paid in tariffs by all the companies and consumers and things like that? Or was it the uncertainty in trade policy that impacted how people made decisions?
I don't want to underestimate the financial burden. I know from like the latest like reporting I've seen, there's like with the tariff refunds that are now potentially in play, it's like $170 billion or something like that. But my take is that the uncertainty is kind of the larger piece, just because it puts so much strain on planning. And then like Graham's mentioning, complicating the, what you're doing in customs and that kind of burden, I think is a huge thing that will like carry on, even if you do eventually figure out, okay, this is what I owe and this is what the financial burden is.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing, a part of the uncertainty, and this might be going in a different direction, was how it caused brands to kind of wake up to some legacy compliance infrastructure, mainly bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones. And I'll touch on the foreign trade zones one specifically around the uncertainty, because as tariffs rose and fell, if you entered those goods during a certain period with what the Trump administration did under these IEEPA tariffs, that rate was locked in. So if you brought it in at that 145 rate, which we showed in that earlier graph, and then the rates dropped down to 40, you have to pay that 145%. So even brands that were like, I'm going to be incredibly strategic about this and defer my duties and put them into a foreign trade zone, still had uncertainty about what was going to happen at the end of this, kind of SKU's life cycle. So yeah, it was the Wild West, I'll say that.
Yeah, Phil already mentioned the risk and the uncertainty, but it's like a new type of risk now that wasn't really around before. It was like COVID, that's also a new type of risk. And now we have like another new type of risk, which is political risk. Like, who knows? And these kind of political risks are kind of unpredictable, because who knew that Canada was going to be, I mentioned earlier that China, the percentage of imports from China was like 13%, dropped to under 10. There's one other country where the percentage went down a lot. You know what that other country was? Canada. So, like totally different reasons and like situations. So, people thought that Canada and Mexico were pretty safe. And it turned out like even they weren't, and Mexico was more safe than Canada, so just like totally unpredictable political risk on top of everything, and politicizing the whole thing. That was one big outcome. And then, like I said earlier, about China, that really did. The decoupling has begun.
Yeah, the Canadian thing was just wild to see happen, because it's like, well, wait a minute, who are we going after here? We're going after the big bad Canadians. Like, what's going on?
It was as soon as that commercial aired during the World Series, all hell broke loose. That's what set it off. Want to touch on real quick the kind of the political uncertainty. Cause totally agree. Now that we've had the IEEPA tariff struck down and 122 is in place, and who knows how long that'll stand before a new lawsuit comes to be. But there's now Section 301 investigations on like 60 countries. And this one is in relation to forced labor, but it's not, do you make products with forced labor as a country, and are you stopping that? It's also as broad as, are you importing products made with forced labor? Are you contributing to a supplier in another market that is using forced labor, has something like that? These are like outside the control of the everyday importer, right? You work with the supplier, you trust them, you hope that they have the proper documents to prove they're not doing with forced labor. But just the fact that they're in that country, and that country couldn't prove to the United States government that they are 100% mitigating forced labor, those are another political risk. It's just like, there's nothing you can do with that. You got to sit back and just let the USTR do its thing. But that's just another complexity layer of political tariffs and uncertainty.
That's a really interesting one because on the one hand, it's like they have to prove it to the satisfaction of the USTR, right? There's no standard or certification that says, oh yeah, we're good. And so I think even though it may be about forced labor, it may be really about something else, right? I think some of these things that came up, particularly the fentanyl, I think was a bit of a paper tiger where they're like, hey, yeah, we're really going to do this, but instead it was trying to annex Canada or something like that.
Yeah, on the forced labor piece, I think the important notion as well for everybody here to have put it on a shirt is that when you go into rooms with customs and they talk about forced labor, they have a term that they like to use, which is from dirt to shirt. You have to prove from that cotton plant all the way until the product is made that no forced labor was involved. And I don't know about you guys that work in supply chain visibility. It's really difficult to be able to go from dirt to shirt. So the level of proof of not being made with forced labor is it's really, really high.
Yeah, maybe blockchain will actually be a thing in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad Graham brought that up because it is putting a larger emphasis on supply chain visibility than ever with that kind of thing. But the 301s, because there's also another one that's on global manufacturing capacity and whether that's kind of impacting the U.S. market. With these Section 301s and then a lot of the Section 232s that have already been in place, the ones that are looming, including we're hearing rumblings that the steel and aluminum ones might get adjusted very soon, and the pharmaceutical ones are coming. A lot of this is building this foundation to maybe not replicate the IEEPA tariffs entirely, but replicate some version of them. And so that's something I kind of am concerned about. And I don't know how, maybe I'm just concerned about this, is that companies think because the IEEPA tariffs got struck down that now it's all over. And I really hope companies aren't thinking that, because I think it's going to be just in a different form. And so like I've mentioned before, we've all mentioned, being ready for this to be a long haul thing is, I think, the way to be ready to be successful.
I'd love to go deeper on that one, because that's really interesting. Because, and Graham, maybe I give this one to you. Once it was struck down by the Supreme Court that EPO was no more, at least in that way, what actually changed from a customs brokerage perspective? Because it wasn't as if all tariffs everywhere were gone. It was just that subsection. So did the Liberation Day floor disappear overnight, or was it replaced very quickly with something else?
Yeah, I mean, it was replaced really quickly. I would call it really kind of a substitution on the floor from a customs declaration standpoint. It just went from the IEEPA 99 code to the 122.99 code. So it was a rather, kind of quick switch. Speaking to, kind of the 301 tariffs and, kind of things changing and not thinking that tariffs are done, just to take a step back and to look at, kind of the first Trump administration instituted Section 301, list 1 through 4B, I think is what they ended up with. And the Biden administration kept those, right? So we saw the Section 301 last 2 different presidential administrations. And here we are moving into the second Trump administration, and Section 301's back. So for those listening, Section 301 is incredibly sticky. It requires investigation, public hearings, right? It's a more formal process. So when these do go live, don't expect there to be a Supreme Court ruling to get rid of 301. These are, kind of legacy tariffs that should last for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Is like Graham mentioned how sticky these are. They have that durability baked in. That IEEPA was no one's ever used that before, so it didn't have that historical precedent. Even the Section 122s that are in right now don't really have much precedent. The Section 122 statute was put in place in the 70s during the Nixon administration, when we were still in a fixed rate exchange rate, and now we're in floating. And so there's I'm not going to get too much into that because it's a little above my pay grade, but there's parts of that might not stand up in court, but because they're temporary, they only last, I think it's 150 days. They're seemingly from the outside, a patchwork way to just kind of hold the line with this kind of global 10% rate so that they can put in these 301s, which will be, more substantial. And as Graham mentioned, have shown to be durable, not just in terms of the legal system, but in terms of both sides of the aisle politically. Now, I don't know if these 301s would stand up, but the 301s from the first Trump administration sure did.
Graham, you brought up an interesting point that the tariffs, for the most part, that Trump 1 put in place were maintained by Biden, and now we're adding more to it. Are we at the point now where elevated tariffs and trade policy, is that now a bipartisan issue? And do we think that future administrations are going to continue in the spirit of Liberation Day?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it'll be as kind of blanketed as it was. Kind of all countries get a certain tariff. I think it'll be a little bit more strategic. And one thing I don't think we touched on here about why the tariffs are implemented would be supply chain security. I think we've woken up to that all of our ocean ports are running on kind of offshore systems or are utilizing kind of offshore products inside these ports. So I do think that the next administration will continue to use tariffs as leverage, as a negotiating tool, but there will be certain commodities and certain products that have to come back to the United States, right? And we have all these, AIs making a big, push here in the United States, right? We're in need of electrons, right? So everybody knows the energy crisis that we're kind of creating. So there's certain kind of commodities that are strategically important to national security that I think all will care about bringing back, and tariffs will be that leverage to get there.
I'll just add, Aaron, I think we really need the money as a country.
Yeah, we're broke.
We're broke. We're spending more than we're bringing in, and tariffs helps. I mean, just like, what are you going to do? Like, we need this money, so it's going to be really tough to get rid of a money generating thing when you're spending more than you're bringing in, and so I think when was the last time we balanced the budget under Clinton? Like 25 years ago, something like that. So it just doesn't look like we're that close to balancing our budget, probably like not in the next like 50 years, So I think tariffs are only going to grow. They're probably going to be worked through whenever the two branches of the U.S. government align, like Congress, Senate, and the presidency is like one party. They'll kind of try to push this through. In fact, maybe even the Republicans are going to try to push it through. Let's see what happens in the midterms. You never know. But there is a way of pushing through tariffs, that can't get challenged by the Supreme Court when Congress approves it. And that's a very legitimate way. That's how previous tariffs have been pushed through. So definitely, this is just like pure, simple economics here. Like, the government just needs this money, and they're going to try to keep raising this. Just like taxes are probably going to end up going up, So can't escape it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's important that like Alex clarified there at the end of it's the government that needs money because other countries aren't paying us for this. Like this is still going to be a burden on U.S. companies, U.S. consumers, but the government needs money some way, and so this is a potential tactic to do so.
Phil, I'm not going to accuse you of getting political, but you just said that other countries don't pay tariffs, which is something that a year ago I didn't think was going to be a point of debate. But no, that's interesting.
You scared me to death right there. I was like, did I say something? But
no, you're good. We talked a little bit about some of the goals or motives that the administration had when it came to announcing Liberation Day and reshaping the trade order. How have you guys seen these policies either move us closer or further away from whatever goalposts they were holding up?
Yeah, hit on the fentanyl one first. So it was really kind of, let's stop fentanyl through the postal system, right? That is a big problem. Millions of Americans are dying. We need to attack this. And when push came to shove, we're doing this right now at Importal. It's a simple tax on postal. There's no review. There's no customs declaration, right? So that whole notion of let's stop fentanyl ended up being somewhat of a let's just tax fentanyl in some way. So that was surprising to me that we moved in that direction versus formal declarations. Customs did say when systems are ready, we will have to do a formal declaration, but like that is an open-ended, who knows when systems will be ready for that. So that was a big shock to me.
Taxing fentanyl, yeah, that's an interesting one.
We touched on it a little bit earlier. I think what Alex mentioned is we have seen like some of the decoupling from China with, imports going down. But I think the overall like trade deficit coming down, I think it's still kind of to be determined. I'm really going to be interested to see what that looks like in the back half of this year because it'll have the comp of what tariffs when those IEEPA tariffs were in and in full force for a longer period of time. We'll also probably at that point have some of these 301s that we're anticipating. Again, it's not a guarantee just because they do 301 investigations that tariffs will come. It just seems pretty likely.
Yeah, they're putting their finger on the weight of the decision there. They know what result they're looking for to a certain extent. Yeah, I mean, I think trade deficit, I guess, is down, not as much as maybe they wanted, but the counterfactual is it'd probably be even worse, or meaningfully worse than it is now if there weren't additional tariffs. The inflation rate was under control. It wasn't a political problem for the Trump administration. Let's put it that way. So there was a little bit of inflation, but it wasn't something that isn't the reason that Republicans might lose the House. There are other reasons, right? I think that the unfortunate thing is that they politicized trade, and added risk, and that for some form or fashion impacts GDP. Hard to quantify it, but all the decisions that weren't made, all the business that weren't started, all the businesses that went out, even because of these tariffs, so that hurts as well. So those are some legacy things, and then let's see what happens with these refunds. I mean, certainly some is going to be refunded, but because of the additional scrutiny and the threat of audit of getting a refund, net the government might make some money on this. We'll see.
Meaning people will just find it too difficult to go through the refund process. They'll say,
meaning
forget
that.
about it.
Yeah, exactly. They may just not want to take the risk, and be audited and have to pay more. That's possible.
That's very interesting. I think it's also insightful to take a look at what the impact for Liberation Day has been on countries not named the United States. And so, one example is as an American in Canada, it's been really interesting to see how nationalistic Canada has become. They call Trump the great Canadian unifier. There's a lot of impetus in terms of making sure that there's better free trade within the provinces of Canada, which is something that should have been resolved, 100 years ago to begin with. But you're starting to see this as a excuse for more countries to show economic nationalism and to say, hey, we are willing to use trade as a weapon because effectively the U.S. has said it's okay, right? And whether it be, Canada with the way that they're restricting certain things coming in and out of the U.S. or other countries, whether it be the U.K., even going back to Brexit, looking at this and saying, how do we shape trade to hopefully give an outcome that maybe economically isn't a perfect outcome, but is impacting, or at least we have the intention of impacting the lives of our citizens. And so I'm just curious, what do you guys see as potentially some other unintended consequences of these Liberation Day tariffs?
Well, I'm particularly interested in how it's going to play into the USMCA review this summer. I know the United States and Mexico have started to have their, I think, like technical talks ahead of it. I don't think the U.S. and Canada have scheduled theirs yet. But as Alex mentioned earlier, and you've mentioned, Aaron, as well. It's a little bit icier U.S. to Canada than U.S. to Mexico. I also think it doesn't seem to me, at least, like a coincidence that we've seen some of like the EU having like new trade agreements with like India and things like that. I think that's also something we're seeing is non-US companies like making sure that they have good partnerships as well. Again, that's kind of more speculation on my part. I doubt that the EU and India were like, oh, hey, the US is doing this, let's rush a trade agreement through. I'm sure that was years in the making, but I don't think it's, like I said, coincidence that it's getting more formalized
Sure.
right now.
I think multiple things could be true there. It could be years in the making, and this could also be the thing that pushed them over the edge to say, we've got to do this now.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think just Aaron, some of the things that you're mentioning about Canada and nationalism, I think it's like a temporary thing. It feels fresh. Liberation's just a year away, but fast forward like 7 years or something like that, especially after this administration, and things are going to be kind of back to normal. The U.S. market is so big, it's so rich, it's like literally impossible to ignore. My company, we help US brands go global, and like Canada's their biggest market usually, and it's like 30-40% of their sales for an American brand. And then we work with some UK brands we launched in the UK, and US is their Canada. Like it's like 60% of their sales are US, 30 is like UK, 5% is Canada. You know what I mean? Like US is everybody's biggest market. And especially in the English speaking world, and I'll throw Europe in there as well, is just like impossible to ignore. And when there's like, really significant economic incentives, people just like rationalize whatever they need to rationalize in their head to like make it work. Like think about the US as like Apple and iPhone users and the onerous 25% tax that the App Store takes, something like that. Like you can hate them all you want, but if you're like an app maker, you just can't ignore Apple. Like there's nothing you can do. You got to pay that 25%. That's where all the customers are, where the rich customers are. So just the reality of it, like this kind of stuff is temporary. I think like give it 5 years, especially after this administration, we're kind of back to normal.
Yeah, Graham, do you agree with that? Do you think that and I love the App Store analogy, but do you think that is just kind of what's going to play out in the future?
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with what Alex says. It's in essence just turned into cost of doing business, right? You want to sell into the United States, you want to sell to the largest market in the world. This is the price to do business. I do think though that things will go back to normal, but normality to me is just predictability. Like a formal USTR publication, you get to comments, right? There's all this kind of forward-looking tariff or compliance. So I think that will change, and I'm very excited for that to happen. But I think just like looking around away from maybe trade directly, just kind of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, right? With Iran basically saying we're shutting down, this trade route of global oil, and what's that done, right? It has turned Iran to have leverage in their conversations and their negotiations. So that has been an interesting one that we've been watching over here pretty closely.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on Hormuz since you brought it up? I know that's certainly a timely issue.
It's something we're obviously monitoring. I think from what our scope of coverage is, we're more on like what it's doing to the supply of oil and what the long-term ripple effects of that will be, which are somewhat to be determined, like how that ripples down into like manufacturers that use plastic and need petroleum to make plastic, that kind of thing. So that's something we'll be watching. I wish I had a little bit more insight to share beyond that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we'll stay tuned to Supply Chain Dive, and we'll make sure to read all this for you. So, well, guys, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I just want to give each of you kind of 30 seconds to go around, and what are some things that you think people should take away in terms of liberation 1 year later? Is it something that is there something that somebody's underestimating that you think people still need to be paying attention to? Is there something that's inherently changed that's never coming back? So maybe we'll start with Phil and Graham and then Alex, and we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm glad you said this because there's one thing I wanted to talk about that I think is really important and something I've heard from tons of sources and stuff is how important cultivating like strong supplier relationships now is more than ever. It's no longer like good strategy to just be like, where can I have the cheapest? If you're able to have like a really good relationship with suppliers, you're able to negotiate, figure out how to like deal with these burdens together. It also helps with like creating that visibility or perhaps having, like Graham mentioned, them change like their invoicing to make it easier for you as the importer. I think that's like one of the best things you can be doing right now is making sure your supplier relationships are strong.
Yeah, on my end, I would say it's time to double click on your product catalog, the HGS codes being utilized. I think historically a lot of brands would rely on their suppliers to do that data, and I've now woken up to the idea of reasonable care from customs, right? That every declaration that comes to the United States, they expect you to have everything buttoned up. So on top of that, I would say really start to audit your customs broker. Plain and simple. Entry comes across your table, you need to audit that shipment and not just trust that your broker is doing everything correctly. So so for those out there, just pay really close attention to statement dates, to making sure that you're not giving the government an interest-free loan in overpayment of tariffs.
I'll close it out with something that's near and dear to my heart, and it's diversification for brands away from the U.S. It made sense even before this whole thing. You don't want to put all your eggs in one regional basket. There could be a recession, there could be something else. And now it's just an even bigger reason. There's just like one more reason for brands to diversify where they're trying to get customers, at least to other English speaking countries. But really, the world is like 20 times bigger than just the US. So good opportunity to start to diversify your client base.
Awesome. Well, good thoughts, guys. Thank you for joining and for sharing your insights. Hopefully, I think, Grant, one thing you said about what we're looking forward to is just predictability. I, for one, couldn't wait for that day to come soon enough, because I think just getting back to running the business instead of trying to figure out, okay, I woke up in the morning thinking that the world was going to go this way and now it's completely different. I'm hoping that those days are behind us, at least on this issue. So, and again, thanks for everybody who tuned in. If you would like to talk to Graham, Phil, or Alex, feel free to reach out to them on LinkedIn.